Yeah, we'll open up the floor because I just want you guys to ask whatever you want. So yeah, Adam, go ahead, buddy.
Yeah, love the movie. First time seeing it tonight, actually. I was going to ask about the dialogue. You don't really reveal your monster, obviously, until sort of halfway through the film. But I thought what really kept the film exciting and riveting was just this wonderful playfulness in the dialogue between your lead character and all the people he encounters. Do you want to talk about that dialogue? It's felt very naturalistic and also very funny. So, with the Cockney English guys who feel like the kind of guys I grew up with in London. So very realistic. I loved it.
Yeah, it's just written dialogue with the exception of, basically it's written dialogue and then we rehearse it with the actors for 3 weeks at a time. We work out the beats and find little funny extra moments. So when they get to set, it's truly, truly naturalistic and has that feeling of being like improvisation. But the English guys in the car, do you know the scene, the part where we used the jump cuts and basically Lou and Thomas, or Nick Never, are in profile. And he's telling the story about the rap battles and about the last time he got in a fight. That's all. That's the only improv in the movie, but it's brilliant. Yeah, they're amazing, those two guys.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, a lot of the reviews kind of compared this to Before Sunrise, and were you consciously emulating that in terms of tone and setup? And the second question is, what's the significance of the title? It's not an obvious title.
So very embarrassing admission. When we were prepping Spring, in pre-production, after the script was written and we were actually going to go make it, was when I decided to watch Before Sunrise for the first time. And I'm really embarrassed to say that because it's clearly like, we did watch, I watched Before Sunrise. Actually, I had kind of a nice story about it. There was, I dated the same girl for about 6.5 years. We broke up and I was single for the first time for like, in my life, basically. And I was seeing this one girl that was pretty cool, and we watched Before Sunrise together while I was prepping Spring. And then, and it was, it's spectacular if you've ever seen it. Of course, it's spectacular. It's one of the best movies ever made. And so the next night, I was just like, do you want to come over and watch Before Sunset? And, Justin, I actually told him about this, and he's like, hey, that's some dangerous magic you're playing with, man. Like, that is, you don't want to play with Before Sunrise with a girl. Like, that's, you're going to put some ideas in their head. And we watched Before Sunset. And then that was actually the release weekend before midnight. We watched that, and then she's been my girlfriend ever since. So it's one of those things, like, that movie is actually that impactful. But that said, though, we were prepping the movie myself personally without even knowing what it was like. You'd seen it, but I don't think it was.
Yeah, I grew up in Southern California, among sort of like Southern California counterculture, and I didn't see a lot of mainstream movies. All I really did see was like Tarantino movies, Linklater movies, Danny Boyle movies, like the 90s, kind of really talky indie stuff. And so now when I write dialogue, it's no doubt that all of that stuff is there, or at least the general approach to dialogue, making it sound like a balance between does this sound like a conversation two people would actually have, and simultaneously is it more interesting than probably a conversation two people would probably have, and does it have like a spark and a crackle to it? So yeah, I mean, I'm in the writing of the dialogue, I'd say it's more simultaneously influenced by like Tarantino and Kevin Smith and Richard Linklater and all these people from 90s indie film than say like exclusively Before Sunrise. But it is a romance, and we do have long steady cam shots of them talking, so it's not avoidable comparison.
And in like old European towns too. So it's
kind
of like, yeah, it's definitely there. Yeah.
And tell me about the title.
And the title Spring is it has something like 3 meanings if you wanted to really dig into it. Ultimately, like, I think the film is probably, if you wanted to assign meaning to it, is about rebirth. And spring is the time of year that we probably associate the most of, out with the old and with the new, the dying of the old and the birth of the young. And actually, the movie literally takes place on the spring equinox. And so, and the movie has a very literal rebirth in it, in what Louise is doing, but also a metaphorical and emotional one for both Louise and Evan, coming into their own, and Louise kind of falling in love for the first time in her entire life, her entire very long life. And so she undergoes an emotional rebirth as well as Evan, after dealing with the grief of his mother. And then on top of that, there is what is actually happening in the film, which is spring coming around. So yeah, I think that is mostly what it's about. There's the season change, as well as the emotional change that brings. And it's a subtle title. It's not one that immediately evokes what the story's about, but I think it definitely evokes what the feeling of the film is about. Especially if you're able to put that title on something that is even more, I guess, there's kind of this juxtaposition of the grotesque with the beautiful in the film, with like idyllic, beautiful Italy and gross nature stuff or these transformations or guy getting his dick ripped off. Stuff like that, or even the juxtaposition of like beautiful romance ruined by a giant dark secret. If you can imagine spring, the title, juxtaposed with some sort of imagery that contradicts it, it gives rise to the feeling that you get when you watch the movie, and that was kind of what we were going for.
What inspired you to create this creature that's like a chimera of different creatures, and also the whole immortality thing?
Yeah, there's our first movie is also, technically it's a monster movie, but there's a plot device as to why we can't show the monster. And that movie was a deconstruction of an old friendship.
It's called Resolution if you want to see it.
And it seemed like the natural escalation from that was to deconstruct a romance, or at least show kind of the typical opening beats of a romance that most people can identify with, and to actually show our monster. And it seemed like, we were traveling the film festival circuit a lot, and it seemed like every single monster movie was about zombies, werewolves, vampires, maybe witches. But it seemed like there were about, at tops, half a dozen different monster mythologies that got recycled over and over and over. So it seems like kind of a both simultaneously fun punk rock and interesting idea to invent a new mythology, to try something new. And when you look at old mythologies of monsters, like vampires, for example, it's like, oh, how are vampires immortal? It's like, oh, they drink blood. From a modern perspective, that doesn't really make much sense. We go with it because we're raised with it. It's in our consciousness from very young age. It's like vampires live forever because they drink blood. Or like Frankenstein, it's like take a bunch of bodies from a graveyard and cadavers, stick them together, apply electricity, and you've got a being. It's like, well, we know that those things don't really work. But it seemed like the idea of a person that could use their own embryonic stem cells to remain immortal, that makes some sense scientifically. And we didn't want to make a film that was like speculative fiction, It ultimately, it's a pretty pulpy thing, the way we treat it in the film. We don't go into camp territory, but it's only kind of a pulpy, fun idea of using one's embryonic stem cells to remain immortal. And then what came with that was that, when we designed this monster, let's do the things that, for example, like the xenomorph in Alien. Like, why do people think that's one of the scariest monsters of all time? It's like, oh, it's kind of nature-based, so it's parasitic. So, since her body operates by nature that we know, we can make the visuals of her transformations nature-based. And in theory, that would have more psychological and emotional impact with the audience.
Yeah, something we found really cool, when we're thinking about it, is like, vampires have these, vampires, for example, we'll pick on them even though we like vampire movies, We'll pick on them just saying like, there's these arbitrary rules. They're genuinely pretty arbitrary. They drink blood to remain immortal, they sleep in a coffin, they get into the bats, you can't see their reflection. None of those tie together in any way. They just are rules about vampires, right? And we kind of found it cool where if you really boil spring down to what it is, it's just this idea of someone that metabolizes their embryonic stem cells to remain immortal. Just that one scientific, like, well, maybe, and during the pregnancy phase, their body freaks out, just like anything. So it's still, you don't really have to reach too far and assign an arbitrary rule. that plus the death of Evan's mother equals the whole movie. You know, and there's not like these other things kind of coming in out of nowhere. It's like, oh, there's this other thing I didn't tell you. It's this rule that I made up. You know what I mean? And that felt really good. That it was like, okay, this all kind of lives in our world in some way, and that you know, we hope we succeeded for it. But that was what scared us. That was what got us, and especially if we can make people care about the characters by falling in love with them and then falling in love with each other, then all of those like kind of real scares that lived in the real world would work even more effectively, at least for us, and then we hope it works for the audience too. So.
How much research did you do? And tell us about your research.
Well, I got in a relationship for 6.5 years just for this movie. So.
But it's like the science, did you just make it up or did you?
That's your question. There's I was pre-med when this movie was written. This was written before we had film careers. Our first movie had gotten to a big film festival, and I think this is dead. Can everyone hear? It doesn't matter. You can only hear me anyways, right?
Yeah,
Our first movie had just gotten to a big film festival. Was still working like nights in a restaurant, sometimes bartending, and working as a production assistant. And while we were mixing this first movie, we had no idea what was going to happen with it. It was like, oh, for my own sanity, I'm going to write another movie. And I wrote this one. And I was supposed to head out to medical school like 5 months later. So I had, you know, enough fundamentals of things like genetics and physiology, general sciences running through my head that, well, I write some pretty neat science fiction. But the thing about science fiction is that it's science fiction. You know, you use it as like a jumping off point, the science of it, and then it's fiction at a certain point. You don't get lost in the details of it. That was a little bit of research. The stuff about like the history of like Pompeii and Louise, the way she sees spirituality, that's all, yeah, like if someone's 2,000 years old, when they were born into like sort of polytheistic culture. They had many gods, and things have changed over time. And we thought it was really interesting how she would see spirituality and how she would see things like the evolution of science. Is that good?
Yeah, that's awesome.
He likes to say that because he makes horror movies, the world has one less doctor.
So when you're coming up with this idea, are you coming up with the story about the relationship first, or is
It was, the very first thought of this movie was the idea of someone that could use their own stem cells to remain immortal. But again, it wasn't like, oh, here's this idea, let's make like a Gattaca-esque speculative fiction movie about it. It was like, no, let's make kind of a pulpy monster movie about that. But the thing is that idea requires an act of love, literally requires sex. So what quickly follows is a romance. And sex. Said he was single earlier.
A couple of observations and a question. I like noticing all the little things in the movie, so all like the bugs, the caterpillars, and stuff. So how you use nature. So that gave me a feeling of spring also. And in the courtyard where they first met the girl, but I like how you shot it. How it was like you, the audience member, was the fourth member. You just happen to look over to the left, and you look over to the right, and then you catch him noticing. So that was cool. Did you plan the airplane shot where it looked like it passed through his head when he was looking at the dead goat? Because I'm like, there's no way you can. There's a plane. Grab it.
So what happened was this. So we that day was the last day of shooting in Polignano, which is the little town, and we were about to head off to do Rome and shoot him wandering around. And I'll be honest with you, I think we told you that they threw us fireworks. You know, they threw us actually that previous night because we were leaving that evening. So, you know, very frankly, we went out and we had some drinks that night, and that morning was when we shot. The morning after that was when we shot that shot with that. And so everyone was kind of moving a little sluggish. And when we looked up, we saw exactly the shot that you see, but the camera wasn't on my shoulder. We looked up and we're like, oh my God, and we just see it so perfectly, and we think like metaphors, you know, like the new world and the old world, and you know, so, you know, we're just thinking like, this just looks incredible and is perfect for what's happening right then. And so we yelled over to the script supervisor, like, hey, just make sure that in visual effects we add that plane back in. And that's what happened. It was a visual effect to add the plane back in to make it, intersect so perfectly. But we did see that. The camera wasn't rolling.
And then the camera, as a kind of having a subjective point of view and kind of wandering and looking at stuff. Our first movie had a very literal subjective presence in the film. And then with this one, when Aaron and I were shortlisting it, we were talking about, like, even though we're not going to reveal in the third act that there's a presence behind the camera, or what one perceives to be the camera, where the image is coming from, that we just like it. We like that subjective point of view, and we like the camera to have a personality, and it became just a part of our style of making films. The camera feeling kind of subjective, like you can wander off and get interested in something else. And
now,
Sorry, you're gonna be so much louder here.
now our camera's always alive, pretty much, and there's always a reason for it. We find it, and it motivates how we shot list, But it's not just like, oh, the camera's alive, therefore it shoots this. It's more kind of like, so what is the camera in this movie? And then we're able to, once we define it, it kind of defines our shot list from there.
Do you want to talk about your decision to shoot in small town Italy and what it was like to shoot with the locals?
Yeah, it was a tough decision. We were thinking, like, man, should we just shoot it on a green screen stage in Los Angeles? Should we? It'll cost an extra $1 million, but at least we're air conditioned,
I'm saying you could have shot in small town America. It might have been cheaper, right?
Yeah, what happened was that when the script was written, again, we were just totally naive and ignorant about the business of filmmaking, like entirely. Our first movie hadn't done anything yet. We had these delusions of grandeur of like what would happen with resolution, and so the script was just written with like, let's just write it for the Amalfi Coast, and then it's done, and our first movie's out there, and it's doing relatively well, and everyone's just like, you're idiots. You cannot go shoot any film on the Amalfi Coast. It's expensive, it's corrupt, there's red tape, there's all these things. And about 20 different people just told us, like, sometimes we'd be like, we want to shoot in this movie in Italy. Sometimes our eyes would just get real big, and they'd just be like, don't do it. Like, why? Like, don't do it. And it'd be really intense, like, okay. Like, it happened over and over and over. And then we were at a tiny little film festival with our first movie in this little town called Trieste. And they were guiding us around. They're like, well, that's the local film committee. I'm like, okay, can we go talk to them? And just because we have this script that takes place in Italy, and we go in there, we talk to him, and we're like, could we shoot it here? It kind of looks like the Amalfi Coast. And he's like, absolutely not, you can't. But he's like, but there's this region called Puglia that has tax breaks and tax rebates and all these things that just started up, and it actually looks, all these towns are basically organized and constructed almost exactly like towns on the Amalfi Coast. So you guys could just find anything you need. Sure enough, they took us on a free location scout with 2 hobo filmmakers and just like showed us we found every location. They came through on everything, and it was like a brilliant, perfect shoot. And the lesson there is that sometimes being ignorant can be a huge advantage. Because had we known what was happening in the industry at that point, the movie would have been written for Jakarta or North Carolina. And it doesn't work quite as well,
And actually, if you guys ever want to like run some kind of a vacation scheme, just be like, yeah, I'm making this movie. Can you like maybe give me a location scout in your area? Get to go see every little site. We have time for, I think, what did you say? 27 more questions. 27 more questions.
I'll take up one.
Yeah.
We have a preacher in the film, and the big money shot, of course, is when he bursts into her apartment.
Yeah.
And she's all the different phases of what she's, you're talking about revolutionary
Yeah.
combination thereof. Just talk about the combination of what were practical effects, because you do a lot of the effects work yourself. And you source out a little bit, but a lot of the work you guys do on your own films is your own work. You very, you do. Some people chip in, but a lot of your film is your film. So to the creature itself, how much of that is practical, how much of that is aided?
I see what you're getting at. Basically, Aaron's really good with compositing,
And what we did is we filmed the bottom half of my body, and I have jeans on right now, so you can't see, but these are tentacles. This one's a bird leg, but
It's real easy.
yeah.
Split screen effect, basically, you know. Yeah, we actually have this practical effects company that we used. We saw this movie. Have you guys seen American Mary by any chance?
Yes.
Go woo! Yeah. Yeah. So American Mary is awesome, and we're looking at it, and we're like, that looks incredibly real. Who are those guys? And then we found out it's two girls, and we asked them, you know, what do you guys use? And they use this company called Masters Effects. And Masters, you know, when we talked to them, they basically, what we liked about them is they had the same ethos as we do. I'm really, I got started as a visual effects artist like 15 years ago and became a director of, you know, over the last like 10. And I'm really, you know, I get really passionate and annoying about it. But I feel like people have this kind of unasked for vehemence against visual effects when, you know, they don't hate visual effects. They hate bad visual effects. They hate misuse of visual effects. Not overuse, just when it's transparent that it's a visual effect you're looking at. You know, that's what people dislike. But nobody's like going on and on about Gravity being 100% visual effects because it works perfectly. You know, and so, and you know, that's kind of what I mean is like, so for us, we go into Masters Effects expecting kind of like most practical effects technicians are like, we're a dying breed, we have to protect our role. You know what the best movies are? 100% practical effects. And we're like, no, dude, you can tell. You can tell that that's latex. You can tell. You know, and so we went into Masters and we realized that they actually have the same ethos as us, where it's you get it as far as you can for real. You get it as far as you possibly can, and then you let visual effects just kind of push it along the rest of the way. And that's where you just kind of figure out the rest of it. And so, you know, for example, when, you know, during the big shot, that was, you know, what you mostly saw was practical. The upper half of her body was practical. And we actually planned to do it all practical, but after some conversations, we realized we could push it just a little further. And so the lower half of her body was done by an Estonian, actually an Estonian visual effects company called Frost Effects. And then I added in the little tail. Shot the tail on a green screen so we could put it on later.
Yeah.
You know, still, it's like you try to really get it if you can, you know, and just push it just a little bit further.
Interestingly enough, that's the bottom half of her body is the only CGI shot in the movie. And the rest of it, it's like, oh, is there visual effects as in it was completed in post-production? Yes, but those elements were shot as practical effects on a green screen and then added in once the cut was long. So ultimately, it is all practical. It's just there's some visual compositing.
We have time for one more.
100 more questions? Really?
Man, we're here a long time.
Jeez, all right, we'll do it. Yeah, let's do it.
Go ahead.
When you were writing, did you always know that it was going to be a happy ending, or did you ever toy with it going the other way?
What's the other way in your mind?
Her choosing to continue living for eternity without him?
Murder.
Yeah, it was always, the ending is the thing that probably changed the least from draft to draft to draft. There was a line added, the line about you can choose to work yourself to death. That line, that was added later. But everything else is still exactly, even the camera move was actually in the first draft of the script, where basically the camera's pushing in, you can hear the transformation happening, but it's some kind of transformation, but it's off screen. So to kind of really throw off the audience and add some tension. But yeah, it was always that ending. However, on the DVD, there's a god-awful alternate ending that we shot while drunk and rum. Yeah.
As a joke, by the way. We weren't just like, you know what we can do? Fix this movie. Time for 3 more, is that what you said? They seem not tired at all and ready to listen to a bunch more questions.
Can you tell us more about Shitty Carl?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
we can.
Vinny Curran, who plays Mike, the bartender in here. He was the star of our first movie, Resolution. And
Chris in Resolution, his character, has a friend that he has sold all his stuff to for his drug addiction named Shitty Carl, that he references. And Vinny insisted on this movie that Mike also have a friend. That basically it would be a connection between the two universes. And,
They're actually the same person,
and-
but you
but-
have to
but
see
it's-
Resolution
but-
to
yeah.
understand why.
Yeah, they're the same person. But it's
Now
funny
I
though,
get it.
because what we realized is that should I even say it? Okay, go ahead. Fuck it. Okay, at the end of Resolution, they say, can we try it another way? And then we cut to black, and the monster seems really upset. So basically, Mike and Chris go and they talk. They don't get killed by it, but they're just like talking about it. They're like, we gotta try this another way. And Chris is like, okay, look, let's switch names. And it's like, I'm Mike, you're Chris now. And then he goes off and becomes a bartender. And he shows up in this movie. He's wearing the same shirt. He's literally wearing the same wardrobe.
And he still knows Shitty Carl.
He's still Shitty Carl.
Literally, this is a sequel to Resolution. We've never revealed that because it's such a stupid idea.
Our next movie takes place in 1899, and we're trying to figure out a way to read Shitty Carl.
Shitty Carl trilogy.
Oh God!
Edgar has the Cornetto, you guys should have the Shitty Carl. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you especially to